I'm John Turley-Yurt, and welcome to FP Executive. We're here with Bruce Philp today. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
November 4th, a day where change is coming. History will be made. And Bruce, you know a little bit about making history. You have a new book out, The Orange Code. It's about ING Direct in Canada and in the United States, the rise of this brand, which began in 1996. And I know you're an expert in branding. You have your own firm.
That's right.
In 1996, ING, a big Dutch bank, came to you and they were thinking about doing banking a little differently in Canada. Can you tell me a little bit how you went about persuading them to reinvent banking here?
Well, it wasn't a hard sell. The parent company's interest was in launching a kind of monoline, business model. So they had essentially a deposit product which offered tremendous interest savings, and then hopefully tremendous interest benefits rather, and then hopefully because of their efficient operating model, they'd be able to both reward the consumer for being a customer and take home some profit at the same time. But some interesting chemistry happened when they began to populate their own team, and the guys that they brought on board, and I mean guys in the gender-neutral sense of the word, had a bit of a rebellious spirit of their own, and were from the mainstream, financial services community, and came already with a sense that change was needed. Mm-hmm. So, rather than having to persuade them that this was a big brandable idea, it was really more a question of putting shape to the natural urge that they already had.
I see. So yourself and your co-author, Arkadi Kuhlmann, has really sort of reinvented banking in a way, looked at, from what I can tell in reading your book, a bit of consumer disgruntlement with the banks, and try to turn that around and use it to your advantage. Can you flesh that out a little bit more about how you tried to take that angst that Canadians had with their banks and use it to your advantage?
Yeah. Well, the first answer is very carefully.
Right.
Canadians have a very complicated relationship with their financial services brands, which I think we're kind of seeing a little bit now in the midst of all this craziness around the world, in the sense that as citizens, they truly value the stability and heritage of those institutions, and I think that there's some unconscious sense that they're connected to nationhood and to our status in the world. But as customers, they find them annoying and worse. And this really flows from a couple of things. One, that a traditional bank, by its nature, is more about the imperatives of operating than it is about the imperatives of meeting consumer needs. In other words, the way a bank can go wrong isn't necessarily by failing to serve consumers, or so it may have been at one time, but rather by failing to operate properly. And so this was the culture of that industry. My partners and I had some years of experience working with one of the big five banks, so we lived this. So that's kind of one piece of it. And then the other piece of it is that although the average person in the street doesn't use the word oligopoly, they know what one is. And they understand that when a marketplace is concentrated in the hands of a relatively few powerful brands, that those brands are A, not always going to act sustainably in their interest, and B, are likely to behave as a herd. They're likely to kind of all do the same thing. And in fact, in consumer research, we even heard this, and still do to this day, where a customer will say, well, I know Royal Bank did this, but I'm a BMO customer, but if Royal Bank does it, then I know BMO's going to do it, in a month or two anyway. So there was a sense of complacency rooted in that, but deeper than that was a sense that there was actually no choice. There was a feeling that consumers, rather like dealing with a phone company or an electricity company, simply were dealing with a public utility, and they didn't have any way to exercise their power as a consumer, the way that they do in other product categories. So for us, you can see the opportunity. It would be very easy to attack customer dissatisfaction with banks, but there's a lot of peril there because of this ambivalence that people have. Whereas the idea that the system structurally deprives people of choice, and then we can come along and offer it to them, that's much safer and much more pro-consumer.
Now, the choice you offered, if I remember correctly, was ING was offering higher interest rates than you would get on a normal savings account,
that's
and
right.
no service charges,
right.
Which in 1996 was a big deal.
Yeah.
I think one could say fairly safely that ING Direct in Canada helped pioneer the service charge less account, being able to put your money in an account and take it out without worrying about the $1.25 charge or whatever it might be. So you certainly leverage the demand for options in that field. Although I know that when I spoke to some bankers on Bay Street from the more traditional brands, they looked at ING as sort of a parasite. That is, latching onto the existing system and sort of drawing savings out of their customer accounts. How was ING Direct received by bankers on Bay Street when you came about in 1996 and afterwards?
Well, I would say probably not well. But what we've learned over the years is that their interest in what we're doing ebbs and flows depending on their own need for liquidity.
Right.
So, there have been times when I don't think they could have cared less about us attracting savings because they were busy lending.
Right.
And there have been other times when there'd be a sort of a sudden tactical interest in trying to either defend outflows that they weren't comfortable with or trying to attract liquidity back into the institution. And then all of a sudden you would get lots of active promotion of savings products from the big five banks. So it wasn't long before we understood that their interest was tactical more than strategic.
Right.
In the very beginning, there were stories about consumers getting kind of hostile, reception at their branches when they were, trying to explain why money was being, funneled out to their ING Direct account. But I don't think that lasted very long. And, Canada is, the Canadian business community is still fairly gentlemanly.
Right.
By comparison to the U.S., so it didn't last.
There's no doubt that, in my mind anyways, it certainly introduced an added element of competition in the deposit market, but ING is obviously expanded. I mean, it does more than, savings accounts. It provides mortgages and GICs and RSPs, and it's also obviously insurance provider as well. It's a huge company. But this orange code, this orange brand, you had a Dutch firm, you have a fellow on commercials who has a Dutch accent. Why did you play up the Dutch aspect of the bank?
Really, there were a couple of reasons. One was that we really wanted to be transparent, and it may sound like a small thing, but the name ING at the time was completely unfamiliar to people. In fact, when they first started looking around for an agency to help them, there were a number of peer companies of my own that simply didn't return their calls because they'd never heard of them. So practically that leaves some question about who are these guys and where are they from. And we didn't want to, particularly in a country where we do have a bit of a protectionist reflex. We didn't want to seem to be hiding anything, and we didn't want any confusion about our origins. And again, I stress that at that time, no one associated ING here in Canada with the insurance business. It was like a complete stranger.
Right.
But the other issue is, the other opportunity rather for us was that the Dutchness had some cultural shorthand that we could use. It would have been a mistake and it would have been disingenuous to overplay this, but the idea that this company comes from Northern Europe and that this guy who's talking to us about the merits of saving money is clearly Northern European evokes some things that are relatively kind of positive in a stereotypical sense. So, we used to say, in a perfect world, the French would be the lovers and the Italians would cook the food and the Germans would build the cars, and maybe the Dutch would take care of our money. So, again, this was a card that would have been disastrous if we'd overplayed our hand, but there was some positive, kind of reflection on us by.
Now, did you test market this at all? And what was, did you get any surprising feedback when
the advertising idea?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we did. And consumers are sometimes very helpful and sometimes not. And this was a case where they kind of weren't. There was a lot of feedback in focus groups, which we tend to avoid as a testing methodology, but they're certainly cheap and fast. A lot of feedback that Canadians at the time felt, well, no, you should use a Canadian, and maybe ideally even a famous guy, like a hockey player or something like that. They're kind of trying to help. And a marketer can make a mistake by letting the consumer build their brand for them sometimes, and this would have been an example of that. But what we had was a pretty courageous client, and a clear understanding that we wanted to set ourselves apart from this herd that I mentioned earlier, this oligopoly, and this seemed like a way to do it. So they were willing to take that chance. And lo and behold, the campaign has been running now for 11 and a half years, and people just love it.
One of the things that interests me is that you've created this brand around an invisible bank, essentially. And I could be wrong, but I think this is really the first invisible bank, so to speak, that has really taken off in Canada. I mean, there are a few other ones that may have followed you. I think maybe Citizens Bank, which I think few people might have heard of, and there's another couple of banks, ICIC, I think it's called. Yeah. But I mean, the model now seems to be ING Direct and the Orange brand. Canada was, in a sense, sort of a launching pad for this model, but you've moved into the United States. Was there any differences towards marketing in the United States as opposed to Canada? Did you shift this around a little bit?
Yeah, well, when they first moved to the United States, they worked with other agency partners, and I think that had something to do with the fact that we had our hands full growing the business here, and my firm was quite small, and business people are nothing if not practical, and so they launched there on a proposition that was very much more driven by the product itself, the rate and the no fees and no minimums. So it was a much more kind of product-driven proposition. But at that time there was plenty of competition in the U.S., but not a lot of competitors to that particular kind of product. So to the point of your question, were there differences? That's the biggest one. In Canada, there really was no competition. There was a lack of choice. We could bring them choice. In the States, there was lots of competition in retail financial services, but not a lot of consumer focus and not a lot of value. So naturally, that became the focus of the campaign down there. And it has kind of remained the soul of it, since then. I think what's happened in the last few years is that the brand has started to acquire some symbolic power as an advocate for saving, which has in turn become quite an interesting subject to Americans.
Well, right now, obviously, yes.
So it's almost become a reluctant hero of financial self-determination, and that's rhetoric that just wouldn't fly here, I think, in Canada, nor be necessary.
Thanks, Bruce. That's really interesting, and I think an important insight in terms of how Canada. Branding worked in Canada and how you had to shift it in the United States. I think we'll continue this discussion a little bit further in part 2 of this interview, and we'll talk maybe more broadly about branding and its importance.
I'd be happy.